This is Steve Wilson at the State Water Survey. So hopefully you're seeing the title slide, Groundwater and Well Construction 101. We're all with the State Water Survey. Our program, the private well class, is sponsored, funded, and supported by RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and with funding from US EPA. And so, we were just doing a bunch of work in the last month or so getting ready for our conference and realized that, we started this program 13 years ago. So it's kind of cool to think about where we're at and those sorts of things. So this webinar and the ones we do every month are part of this national program. We're partners with RCAP, which I'll talk about them in a second, to support private well owners nationally. And we do talk to well owners all over the country. We work with professionals that work with well owners. And so the materials here follow our course, which this is not the private well, quote, class. That is a 10-lesson class that you sign up for online at privatewellclass.org. And it sends you a lesson once a week for 10 weeks currently. If you sign up for that, there's a lot more material there. Each lesson is 6 to 10 pages long. That provide a lot more detail than I would be able to provide today in our 2 hours together. Couple things to note. We do record all of these, and they're all available eventually on our YouTube channel, the Private Well Class YouTube channel. And if you asked a question, we'll get to some of those today. But if we don't answer your question, or if during the webinar today you have other questions, you have a chat box or a question box on your GoToWebinar screen that you can type a question into. Katie's going to monitor that, and we'll put those all together, and we'll go over those at the end. And we'll stay, as long as you have questions, we'll stay and answer them. And there's a handout tab. There are 2 handouts for those looking for continuing education credit, and also the agenda for today. Okay, so for the CE side of things, continuing education credit, we're a provider for NEHA, the National Environmental Health Association, and Illinois LEHP credit for licensed environmental health professionals. And so at least for NEHA, their credentialing cycle is 2 years long if you're a NEHA member and you maintain your license that way. So if your credentialing cycle just ended at the end of April, so you're starting a 2-year cycle, and you do this webinar today, then you can't get credit for it again until after May 1 of 28. And so we've listed in the bottom right corner the other times we've offered this particular class in the last 2 years, and just so that everyone's aware. And we can also provide a copy of the slides. I know that was one of the questions someone asked. We can certainly provide a PDF of those. In theory, if you are interested in CEs and you need a certificate, you already asked for that when you register, and so that's done automatically. You don't need to send us an email if you ask for a certificate when you signed up. But any other questions related to today's webinar, you can email us at info@privatewellclass.org. So again, I'm Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist at the State Water Survey, which, we're part of the state of Illinois and the University of Illinois. We do applied research, all kinds of fun stuff, including service. We house the state's well logs. So we're really in the game, especially for Illinois residents on the private well side, but we do work all over the country. Katie Buckley is here. She keeps everything organized, does all the logistics, and she'll monitor the questions in the chat or question box today, and also deals with all the continuing education stuff after the fact. And Sally Dolan, she's an EHP and also our senior scientific specialist. She did provide some of the answers that we have in the slides today, and as well as we'll help the questions possibly at the end. Okay, so that's who's here. So RCAP, they're a national nonprofit that for over 40 years, almost as long as the Safe Drinking Water Act's been around, they've provided support for rural America, specifically for water, wastewater utilities, sometimes housing, sometimes economic development. But many of their staff, they have about 300 or so around the country, in every state total. Many are water and wastewater operators. as well as now a growing number are private well professionals that work with us and we work with them. Um, they're called a partnership because it's actually 6 individual nonprofits that together cover the entire country, as well as uh, the Pacific and Caribbean islands that are part of U.S. territories. And so if you're interested in working with RCAP, we can get you to the right person in your state. There's a number of services they provide. Uh, One is this well and spring assessment. We developed this with a group of experts back in 2016, I believe. And it's if a well owner is having a particular problem, or it's a, a difficult trying to solve a problem, or really just wants to know more about, are they doing everything they can to protect their drinking water? RCAP will come out and do an assessment. They'll meet with you in person. They'll take pictures. They'll look up your log in advance if it happens to be available through the state or county or local health district. And then they'll ask a lot of questions. What kind of plumbing you have? Do you have any treatment? When's the last time you got a water test? All of that's in this. This is just the first page of a, I don't know, 6 or 7 page document. You really have to have some expertise to use this document, and that's why they go out and do those. In a few states where the state health department may not have a lot of staff, just because of funding, they'll actually request the RCAP region or state leads in their state to go out and help them, where they've got a question from a homeowner and they don't have the bandwidth to go out and actually look at the situation. Then RCAP will go out and do that for a state agency and try to solve whatever the problem may be. It typically includes a water test as well, and each region does those just a little bit differently, so you'd need to talk to them if you want to have a well assessment done. But we can certainly get you to the right person if you email us, or you can go on any of the region's websites and find their private well page, and most of them have a link to sign up for a well assessment. And what they really are, they're like, if you're a health department person and you do deal with sanitary surveys for public water supplies, then it's really like a sanitary survey for a private well. Vulnerability assessment, trying to determine if there's any deficiencies. This is all voluntary. No one's going to turn you in or any of those sorts of things. It's really between the well owner and the RCAP person. But the idea really is our goal is to educate well owners about their specific situation and well. And I say that because no 2 wells are the same. Even if you go to a subdivision where the one driller put in 15 wells for 15 houses and moved on, there's typically something different. Where the septic tank is, the geology changes over the location, the type of pipes they may have in their home, if they've added treatment, all those things. We've been to literally thousands of homes with wells, and rarely do you see 2 that are identical and with all of those characteristics. So the idea is to go through the assessment, promote best practices, and it's a chance for you to ask questions as a well owner. One of the questions we get a lot is, I haven't gone to my health department, my local or county health department, because I'm afraid they're going to tell me I can't use my well. Well, we can tell you that there's only a few very local jurisdictions where they have that kind of authority, but in almost every state, probably 99% of the country, they can recommend you don't use your well if it's got arsenic at 10 times the health standard for a public water supply, but they can't force you to not use it. And so it's really about learning. It's giving you a chance to ask questions as a well owner. It's also encouraging communication. You find out who the people are, like where your log came from or where we found geology about a given area, and so that you know a little more about your well and can ask better questions when you do have a problem. And so they're really useful. And they'll complete the assessment, put a copy of the pictures in the log and anything else they find, and they'll give this all back to you filled out as one document that is yours to have and use, with recommendations, like why you should sample for coliform nitrate every year. They've done over 3,800 of these around the country. It's actually probably closer to, it's over 4,000. Now I need to update this number. But they also do other services. If you're a professional and like at a local health district, they will work with you to put on a workshop for your well owners in your area. They're willing to show up at night, bring in drillers or other folks or themselves to give talks, all those sorts of things. And so they're really an active partner. And what we know, in all honesty, is we have a great program. We do. We're very fortunate. We help a lot of people, but there are 5 of us maybe working on this at the Illinois State Water Survey. We can't cover 23 million private wells and 58 million homeowners or families on private wells. And so this is by and large a partnership type of program. And working with the RCAP regions, with a number of state and county health departments or local health districts that we've met over the years, when we get calls or get questions, a lot of times we're trying to find someone locally, or we already know somebody locally who can assist better, who knows the geology, is familiar with an area, those sorts of things. The same with the RCAP folks. And so lean on them, use them. It's all grant funded. Everything we do is free. We're putting on a conference next week, and we have over 100 professionals coming to Montana to watch 3 days or listen to 3 days of presentations in person. It's all free to attend for professionals that have already registered. And so we're able to do that because of the funding we have from US EPA. And the same with the RCAP. The assessments are completely free. They're really a useful tool to help folks understand their well, their situation, maybe why they need to add treatment, those sorts of things. And so a little bit about the State Water Survey. And I'm going to pop a Diet Coke. I apologize, but I'm going to get really thirsty in a minute. So the Water Survey was started in 1895 by our state legislature. It's very similar to a state geological survey or natural history survey, which nearly every state has. Illinois is really the only state to have a state water survey in the capacity that we have. We house the state's well logs. A number of state mandates, including reporting of water use, come through the state water survey. We monitor water levels and water chemistry around the state. I think I just mentioned we house all the state's well logs for private wells. And so a well owner can call us where they live, and we can look up their log if it's available, or tell them about the geology, any known contaminants, all that sort of stuff. And we also do applied research and other types of service and outreach projects like this one. I'm fortunate to be able to do both. I did a lot of work looking at arsenic in groundwater and a number of other things. It's a unique place to work where you get to apply all of the science that you actually develop. And actually, what we do is on the practical side, not on the theoretical side, like some of our university colleagues. And it's really a good spot to be in. Whenever we find out about a problem, we can try to address it and do the research to understand how to solve that problem. Because we've been around so long and we've worked with communities and drillers and everyone else, we have a huge archive of really cool pictures like this one and information when communities were first being built or first building their drinking water treatment plant or their wastewater plant. And so this is Maple Park, Illinois from 1922. That's the drill bit and the drill stem. And we have well records going back over 120 years. This is a particular interesting log I like to show. So right after the Depression, the Community Conservation Corps was developed to put people back to work, and every state had folks who were hired to do different kinds of jobs. In Indiana, they built infrastructure at state parks. In Illinois, they hired young engineers to go out and inventory wells. Why that happened, I don't know, but this is a log that was put together in the early 30s. I think the date's further down on the sheet, but it's near Rushville in Schuyler County. At the time, the well was already 60 years old. That puts it back into the 1870s, and it was 135 feet deep and hand dug. I grew up on a 14-foot hand dug well. My grandpa hand dug in 1933. And the idea, I've been in that well. It's brick lined, uncemented brick. It's spooky to go down 14 feet. I can't imagine someone hand digging a well 135 feet deep. So it's really interesting in that respect. The pump they have, you can see there at the bottom, is 2 buckets and a chain. And that's because they put a hand pump on it. And if you have to lift water, 80, 100 feet or more, you're pumping that hand pump like crazy for a long time just to get water to first come out. And so they found that difficult and decided 2 buckets in a chain was a better way to go. And again, this is in the early 30s. And so the young engineer that did this work, Arthur Thompson, this is the deepest hand dug well so far, and the water level is at 60 feet. So yeah, it's pretty interesting, and there's a lot of history, and it goes back to a lot of the similar work that was done here on water treatment, wastewater treatment, understanding septic and how that affects groundwater, all that sort of stuff. So it's a really cool place to work, as well as there's a lot of information here that helps us when we're going to this area to know the geology for that sort of thing. And this is the way wells used to be done. Once the hole was drilled, this is a large well going into the University of Illinois in the 20s. And every 10 feet, they put all those rivets in to put the two pieces together, then welded it, and then put those spacer bars on it to go 10 feet at a time. What a nightmare. And I imagine weeks of work to put in one well, where today it's fairly streamlined. Obviously, most wells aren't this big. This is for a big production well for like a utility or community would have, but it speaks to the how far we've come technologically on things like putting wells in. And here's an old rig from 1922. Yeah, you can't see it off to the right, but there's probably a steam engine that's running to turn all these wheels to do the drilling, and it's a pounding rig, so it's it's not the way it is today. So the important thing is getting back to our topic. Wells aren't regulated. They're regulated at construction and tested in some states at construction. But once they're installed and they're in place, there are a few states that have rules when you sell a property with a well, but in practice, wells really aren't regulated at that point. So if you have a well in your home, it's already in place, you're responsible. No one's going to come and test it or do any of those things for you. In fact, a lot of private well owners prefer that the state or anybody else doesn't get involved in the first place. The other thing to remember is that your water can look, smell, taste like it's amazing, but arsenic, for one, is odorless, colorless, and has no taste. So you have to test. That's the bottom line. You always want to test. We have other webinars where we talk more about testing. I'm not going to do that today, but what we recommend is you test annually for coliform nitrate, and that's really to determine if there's any surface influence in your well water, which means there's a pathway from the surface down into your well, which is bad, and then a set of inorganics and metals or known contaminants in the area every 3 to 5 years. So more on that in a future webinar, or if you go back and watch one of our past webinars on our YouTube channel, you can find that information. And today, I pay $80 to $100. I've had to update this so many times. When I first started doing this 13 years ago, I think it was 30 to 50. And so now it's high because my daughter's 14, and I can't tell you how many times I'm yelling at her to get out of the shower. But that's the cost I pay as getting my water from a public water supply or community water supply instead of a well. And that's spread over all 150,000 homes or residents here, more than 150,000 residents total, for maintenance, maintaining pressure, making sure that all the infrastructure is in place, it's been tested, that you have a licensed operator who's making sure that it's safe. All those things are your responsibility as a well owner. And so that's the thing to remember. You're basically a water operator for a very, very small water supply, the one that supplies your home and your family. And so you need to consider all those things that go on. It's really, our program is about making well owners aware, helping them understand things like your well log, which we're going to do that today. Why you need to know if you have a screen on your well, how deep it is, and how much casing there is. You can have a 600-foot well with 20 feet of casing, or you can have a 200-foot well that's got 195 feet of casing in the screen. Those are very different. Water can only get in certain places versus over the entire well bore when the casing's so short. So knowing where to look or who to ask about natural occurring contaminants and any other water quality issues, not just your neighbors, but your extension, your local health district, your state water agency. All those folks can be helpful. You have to be willing to be kind of an investigator a little bit and find out where those local sources are. And hopefully, if you go through our class as well as these webinars, you'll learn to ask better questions. That's the goal. Is if you're asking, all the basics about your system, where your pump's at, all that sort of stuff, then you can get to the meat of the problem if you're having one and ask better questions to try to solve that and understand how to fix it. And then again, sample your well. I'll say that maybe not as many times today as in some of our webinars, but it's important that you know what's in your water, if anything. And so today it's more about groundwater and wells. So we're gonna have a little geology lesson, as well as then going to well types and some of those things. So there are two types of aquifers. One is porous; it's unconsolidated. So sand and gravel is the best example. I'm in Illinois. We have glaciation here, so we don't have bedrock at the surface over most of the state. There's some areas where it does, but where you have this yellow is meant to be sand and gravel, and when you have a volume of sand and gravel, it's got the area between the grains is air unless it's got water in it. So if you have a jar of sand, there's airspace in there in between each of those grains of sand. In a uniform sand, it's almost 30%. So if you have 100 feet of sand, thick aquifer, and it's full of water, you took all the sand away, you'd have 30 feet of water. That's a lot of water. So sand's usually a very prolific type of aquifer. In a porous system, it's, and there's a term below here called effective porosity, which in some cases, they're not all interconnected. Maybe there's some cemented sand or there's some clay in that material that prevents some movement of water over some parts of that aquifer. Then if it's not all connected, then your actual porosity is going to end up being less, because it's not only that's the volume of water you have available, and yeah, it matters whether it can flow freely through the sand to get to your well. And that's why you see a lot of irrigation wells like in river valleys, because there's a lot of alluvial, which is lake or river laid sand and gravel. It's all connected, and you can put a large well in pumping 1,500 or more gallons per minute, where in a home you're using 5 gallons per minute, and the aquifer can sustain it because there's enough volume as well as it can flow freely to get to it in order to provide that. So a fractured system, which is bedrock, water doesn't flow through bedrock. It flows through the cracks and fissures in a rock system. So it's important when you put in a bedrock well that you connect to some of these fractures, because that's where all the water is going to come from. And because of that, you can't have a casing, solid casing, all the way through the length of your well, because that will also cut off the fractures. And so that's why I'll show you an example in a little bit. As far as unconsolidated material on the top, that's the sands and gravels, alluvial sands. It's not bedrock, basically, versus consolidated aquifer material on the bottom is anything that's kind of a bedrock. It's, whether it's fractured bedrock or if it's granite, like in the Rockies they have granite, that has very little porosity. There's very little connection in the fractures. A lot of times you see real problems finding water in those areas. And on the opposite side, where you have karst topography and limestone and karstic limestone, like in southern Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, you have sinkholes, you have springs, you have very connected underground caves that are full of water. And so all that water is connected, but it's also connected to the surface, and typically is more likely to have surface contamination than some of these others. The other term, so the porosity is the volume available of water in a given geologic unit, and the other is permeability, which is, it's not exactly, but it's basically a velocity measurement. So when you have larger particles like gravel, it's very highly permeable. Water can move very rapidly through that. It shows here 300 feet to 3,000 feet a day. So water moves based on pressure. It goes from high to low. So the best example I can give you, I'll give you two. One is if you pour water on the end of a table and then you lift the end of the table up, what's the water do? It runs downhill. It's trying to be equal at an equal pressure. Or if you think about your bathtub, it's flat in your tub until you pull the drain, then water flows towards the drain and runs out. It's trying to fill in the space where the pressure is higher. And what we share with, especially with school kids a lot, is if I have a juice box and I have a straw in it, what happens when I squeeze it? You put pressure on the system and it makes the water come out the straw. Same way in an aquifer. Water wants to flow from high elevation to low. So where water levels are higher in a well and another well nearby has a lower water level, then you know the flow direction is towards the lower water level. And so how fast it can move is partly dictated by the type of material. So gravel, sand, silt, and clay are the things you'd find in unconsolidated materials. There's a mistake on here, which is actually a mistake in the original diagram. Clay can be relatively permeable. It says here it's really relatively impermeable. It can hold water, it can be porous and have even 20 to 30% porosity, but because clay particles are so small and the way they're shaped, it's really difficult for water to move through it. And so it's really relatively impermeable, where water moves 1 foot in 10,000 years to 0.1 foot a year. And it's kind of like the example of what isn't an aquifer versus the sand and gravel at the top that are, where you consider silts and clays more aquitards, or they either are very slow at water movement or um, basically stop it. And in those cases, you can't put a well in there because as soon as water can't refill the well once you start pumping it. And that's the difference. Water has to be able to flow to the well, and that permeability is what tells you how well that goes. And on the rock side, you've got the same thing. Limestone's considered permeable because of a lot of fractures and solution cavities, which are those caves and sinkholes and all those things. Sandstone, same way. It can be fairly cemented, but it also has fractures, and in some cases can actually have water in the rock, which is different than all the other examples. Shale and extreme rock like granite typically are very poor at providing water to a well, and water moves through them very slowly, although it can still flow through those. And I'll show you that in a little bit as well. These are just 4 examples. Wisconsin has a booklet, and I thought this was a good way to show it. It's kind of idealistic, but the crystalline bedrock in the bottom left is kind of like granite. The dolomite on the upper left is really it's plated, but there's fractures, and so it moves between the fractures and works its way down. More in reality, you're going to have different types of bedrock, which is the bottom right. I guess I said that wrong. Where you've got sandstones and dolomites, but you could also have shales and other things, and so it gets complicated. And then in sand and gravel, if this is just a large tank full of sand and gravel, and you pour water in the top, it's just going to start moving through because of gravity, and that's the solution front you see there. You put enough water in, it'll stay saturated as it fills up. And so those are just kind of idealized examples to give you an idea of where the water is, what you're up against when you're trying to put a well in, and trying to find a unit where you can get enough water for a well. And this is from Iowa Department of Natural Resources, and we've modified this and redrew it. But this is more what we see in Illinois, right? We see at the top is the land surface, and there's a small river. You can have wells that are down in the alluvial sands, which is the darker colored, sand colored stuff, which means it's fully saturated with water. You also further in the uplands, you might find smaller aquifers that folks are using that were left by glaciers, and that's the well on the upper right. And then as you move down through and hit bedrock, you can have dolomite or shale, sandstone, all kinds of different kinds. Typically, you're going to get water like in this deep well. The water is in the well goes all the way down to the sandstone, but it's probably taking water from the sandstone and both limestones because they're trying to take advantage of those fractures. And that casing probably goes somewhere into the first limestone and stops. And after that, the well you've drilled the borehole the drillers put in acts as the casing. It's solid rock. You put a hole in a piece of rock, you've just got a hole, right? It doesn't cave in. It doesn't, and that's really what you're after here. Where that matters, and I'll show this probably more than once, uh, this is a hydrologic cycle, right? Just as all the groundwater side. When it rains, water comes in, gets some of it runs off to a stream, then to the river, and evaporates and starts all over again. Some of it makes its way down through the soil. Some of it gets taken up by plants. If it makes its way to the water table on the uppermost part of the soil, then it can get into an aquifer, and then that's always moving. It's part of a cycle. It's moving towards a discharge point because water levels are higher in this diagram on the left than they are on the right where the discharge area is and the stream is. And so that's because of the pressure difference, water's being pushed towards that outlet. Some of it makes its way through those gray thin lenses. Those are the aquitards, so those are shales or clays, silts. Eventually it will to get through that though, and then if some of it runs off and comes back up, some of it, yeah. So you can date water using different methods and different isotopes of given elements, and sometimes they're thousands of years old. They've been in the ground, but even that water will eventually make its way back to the surface, and so it's a pretty interesting process. As far as aquifers go, I've already kind of given examples. As far as a well goes, there are three types of wells. Dug or bored well, which is usually put in, it's shallow. It's in an area where there's mostly clay and silt, and there's no real aquifer available, or at least they don't know of one. And so, like in my case, where I grew up on a small farm in central Illinois. My grandpa put in a 14-foot hand dug well. If he would have known that there was an aquifer at 70 feet, he might have had someone drill that, or might have tried to find a way to get that done because it would have been a better source for sure. But a lot of times those are either really old or there is no aquifer available per se. We have areas in southern Illinois where you could put in a well, but it's saltwater. It's still you run into saltwater once in a while in different places. That's left from before glaciation, and there's an inland sea in the central part of the United States, and it is literally has a TDS of over 10,000. So it's really salt water. It had to be treated to use. Sand and gravel wells are just what they say. They're in sand and gravel aquifers. They have a screen, and drilled wells in rock. There are various types, but again, most of the time, unless it's really friable material, most bedrock wells only have a casing down into the rock, and then it's an open hole. You may have choices. I didn't show a diagram here, but in Champaign County, where we live in central Illinois, there are two separate sand and gravel aquifers at different depths, and then there's bedrock, and all of them are a potable water source. And so, depending on the situation, if one got contaminated, you could go to a deeper one. We don't have that situation, but it's knowing what's there. In other cases, you don't have any choice, so you put in a bored well because it'll take water that infiltrates into the shallow soil and to the water table, which isn't necessarily an aquifer, but just a saturated unit below ground, and water can seep into a well slowly. And I'll explain that probably next. So dug and bored wells. These are all examples of dug and bored wells. The one on the right is the 3-foot concrete tile. One on the upper left is an old hand dug well, and you can see they've got it covered with 2x6s and 8s, some tin, and then some good concrete blocks and rocks to hold all that down. It's not waterproof in any way. The reason that looks so muddy off to the bottom right is because it's in a cattle pasture and the cows are coming there and rubbing on those posts to scratch and doing their business, and it's all infiltrating into the ground right there. You can also have a bored well, which is a large diameter well like the one on the right, that looks like the one on the lower left, where it's all you see is the drop pipe or the casing coming up, and I'll show you those in two diagrams here. The old hand dug wells, they can be, they're as different as every person who dug it. So they all look different. They all provide water differently. Some are brick lined, some have maybe some kind of culvert used for and with slits in it, but they're really shallow and they're susceptible to surface infiltration. These are two accepted construction methods in Illinois, and so the one on the left is the 3-foot concrete tile with the concrete top, where here those 4-foot sections of concrete tile just sit on top of each other. There's a male in and a female in, and they're not cemented in any way, so water can seep in each of those junctions, so every 4 feet. In this diagram, you can see the water level's down about halfway. They put concrete for the upper 10 feet. That's our rule in Illinois, so that nothing right at the surface can get into the well. And then below that, the hole you drilled to put in this 3-foot tile is 3'6" or maybe more, 4'2", sometimes 4 foot 2 inches, and they filled that with gravel to create more space. So the whole point here is there's these little sand lenses you might hit, but otherwise this is all fine textured soil. It's clay and silt mostly. So the water can be in the water table there, which is in that clay and silt because it does have pore space, but water moves so slowly that it can't really supply a well continuously. And so you build this large diameter well. It acts as a big cistern or a big storage vessel. And, at night, it may fill up during the day, and you've got 25 feet of water here. You take a shower and start 2 loads of laundry. It may drop down near the pump. And then everyone goes to bed that night. It slowly starts filling back up. And again, it's moving towards the well, but so slowly that you couldn't continuously pump this like you could a sand and gravel well. And the difference in these two is really just the way it's finished at the top. That concrete pad that you see on the left at the surface is down at 10 feet or more, with then a hole in it for a regular well pipe riser, that then you can, it looks like a regular drilled well, a sand and gravel well or bedrock well. And so either of those work. Every state has different rules. Actually, 2 states have no construction rules, which is also a problem. But this is kind of the typical bored and dug well, or the bored well construction that we see today. Sand and gravel wells, as I mentioned, they have a well screen. So think about your storm door. You have a screen in the summer, so you open the door to let the air in. It keeps the bugs and everything else out. Same way with a well screen. It's sized, the slots, they're called, in that screen, which is the stainless steel thing you see there. They're sized based on the geology. So whenever the driller is drilling a well, he's pulling up cuttings, if it's a reverse mud rotary rig. And if it's finer sand, then those slots need to be much smaller. And typically what they'll do is they'll try to get to the bottom of the sand and gravel unit, because like everything else, whenever water's running and that sand's being deposited when the glaciers were melting, the biggest particles fall out first. So the bottom of the sand and gravel aquifer is likely to have larger particles, and that means the slots can be a little bigger without letting sand in. You have to keep the sand out of your well because sand's abrasive. Think about sandblasting, all those things. It will wear your pipes and your pump out if you don't. So it's a real big deal to make sure you've sized your well screen to match the size of the sand or gravel you have in your aquifer. You also put a gravel pack around your well screen, which it shows on the diagram, and that is a uniform size sand that you purchase. There's several companies that provide that around the country, and that it's too big to go through the screen, but it's small enough that it's going to trap a lot of any of the really fine sands that might try to come through. And so it's just another way to keep sand from getting in your well and up in your pump. And so, we get calls from people who are saying, my well's starting to pump sand, I'm catching it in my sediment filter. What do I do? Well, you likely have a breach in your screen, or your gravel pack has somehow been depleted, or there's been some kind of, it's likely not fixable, to be honest, in most cases, just because it means there's nothing you can do with that down at depth. This could be 200 feet below land surface. But the other thing that's important here is water. A sand and gravel well is solid pipe until you get to the screen. So if I have a 200-foot sand and gravel well with a 5-foot screen on the bottom, The only place water can get in that well, if it's properly designed and constructed, is from 195 to 200 feet below land surface. And that's great for concerns about surface contamination or anything infiltrating near the surface. I tell people, if they're, well, my yard backs up to a farm field. Well, what kind of well do you have and what's the geology? It may not matter that they're applying pesticides close to your well. If your well is properly constructed and it's getting water from a deeper aquifer, like here in Champaign County, there's 80 feet of clay and silt at the top, and very little makes it through that. And so it's not like if you had sand at the surface, which is we also have in certain places in Illinois. So this is a well log in our files. If you go to the bottom right, you can see that there's topsoil, brown clay, gray clay, sand. There's a thin 6-foot sand and gravel, and then you hit more clay. Well, 6 feet isn't a lot to put a well in, mainly because it may not be that extensive since it's so thin. And so they went further down, and at 260 hit fine sand, which they called tight, and then regular, more just sand, and then near the bottom, sand and gravel, as I mentioned earlier. And so in this case, if you go up a little bit to number 22, they put in casing, 291, and then put in a 4-foot 20-slot stainless steel screen at the bottom. And this is for a home, a 4-foot screen, and as much sand as there is here and as much water there is. The other interesting piece here is you go down to 23, the static water level was 159 feet. So the water's coming up into the clay. So there's pressure on the system, so it's considered artesian. It's not flowing, but water level is only 159 feet, even though the aquifer doesn't start until 260. And so the pressure on the aquifer from further away is causing, it's like squeezing that juice box I mentioned. There's pressure, a higher pressure somewhere else in the aquifer that's forcing the water level to come up to 159 in the well. And so when they pump this at 20 gallons a minute, which a lot of times when you pump a well that you're installing as a driller, you use your own pump first, and you'll like put in twice or 3 times the size of pump that you're actually going to install for a homeowner. And so most times that's a 5 gallon per minute pump, or maybe 4 gallon per minute. And so they put in a 20, and even pumping that, they didn't say how long, but typically an hour, unless there's a problem, it only dropped 6 feet. So there is a boatload of water available here. And you could put an irrigation well here and probably not, pump 1,000 gallons a minute, and you could pump it continuously. And so it's just a really thick unit that's probably thicker in other places even than this 35 feet. And I will also note, I need to step back. They didn't go to the bottom of the aquifer. They went until they hit material that would be a good place to put a well screen. This sand and gravel could have went 30 more feet or 50 more feet further down. But because the water level is so high, and they knew that when they were drilling, I'm sure, there was no need to go any further and cost the homeowner additional funds when, there's plenty of water. They were 100 feet ahead from their wells at 290. So, it's interesting when you look at a log and you figure out what you can find out from this. So they're estimating the yield going back to number 3 at 40 gallons per minute. They did put in a 15 gallon per minute pump, which actually means that they must have had other needs, like they put in an irrigation system in their yard, or they have livestock, because you wouldn't need a 15 gallon per minute pump for a private well, for a home that's just for that purpose, for the home. Kickapoo Drilling is a company that drilled that well. They're here in Illinois, central Illinois. They have their own software and created this nice little graph that's got kind of shows where they set the pump and where the water levels are. We still have well logs submitted on paper, which is something we'd really love to see changed. We scan them, that's why these are in here. But they're using a system, an online system, and it'd be great if we were actually having the drillers use that directly to file logs, even with the county health departments and the state, so that we don't have entry errors when we're entering some of this information that we get on paper. The third type is a bedrock well. And as I mentioned, it's a usually a steel casing, or at least near the bottom where it's seated is steel casing. Um, and so because rock is solid, you drill a hole, um, and once you hit bedrock, you go down until you hit some fractures. And that's what this diagram's trying to show you. There's one major fracture that runs through it that you can see the blue, two minor ones closer to the bottom. But if you don't, you can see how far the casing goes down. It goes down about a third of the way into that bedrock there. Typically, they go 10 to 20 feet. Most states require that you have at least 50 feet of casing total. So in an area where you have bedrock at the surface, there should be at least 50 feet of casing. Older wells, though, that are before those rules were put in place, may only have 15 or 20 feet of casing. I was working in New York State and upstate New York, and ran across a bunch of wells that had were 300 or 400 feet deep. It only had 20 feet of casing. And what that means is because water's coming just from these cracks and fissures in the rock, it's like pipe flow. It could be coming from a little further away. It's wherever those fractures are and wherever they lead to, it could lead back to the surface. And so even having 50 feet of casing isn't always doesn't mean that when you start pumping a well in bedrock that it might not lead back to an area where there's recharge from the surface getting into that geologic unit. And so we just tell people to be more wary. It's important to know how much casing you have, and not just how deep your well is. One question we get a lot is, what's deep? And that really depends on the situation with the geology here. Um, when there's 80 feet of clay on top of above the surface, then for a sand and gravel well, then even a 100-foot well is pretty deep because it's going to be protective. Or when we say shallow wells are more at risk, that's typically something that means. I guess the best definition would be that it's susceptible to surface contamination. Then it's too shallow if there's choices. But again, because it's like pipe flow, just through given fractures, a lot of wells you may only hit one fractures, depending on how tight the bedrock is. That means water can be coming from further away than it would in a sand and gravel aquifer where it's all coming from near the well. And so that means your water quality could change over time, or it could be drawing water from places with either better or worse water quality. And so here's a typical bedrock log. This is a camp up in Algonquin, Illinois, which is a Chicago suburb. If you go back to the bottom right, you can see that they hit bedrock around 189, and then hit limestone till 257, and then they hit shale. So they stopped. The bedrock is the aquifer. The shale is not going to have any water in it. And so then if you go up to 15, and this is an older log, so the other log was newer, and so there's more numbers, right? Here it's 18. On the other log, it was 24, I think. And that's because our state health department updates these forms, requires more information, things that we learn are beneficial that need to be recorded for anyone who might need this type of information. And so that's changed over time as well. But here you can see that there's 179 feet of PVC and then 20 feet of black steel in number 15. And so to seat that in a rock, it's called a I think it's just called in the old days they were lead, but it's a thing that kind of forces it to stay tight in the bedrock. So there's a seal around the outside of the casing, so it can't go down further in the formation. And so you try to do that with PVC, and you put any torque on it, you'll crack it or break it. And so the bottom part of that is steel. Most of it is PVC, just because it's cheaper. And so the homeowner, I'm sure, or the camp was appreciative of that, because the 200 feet of steel is a lot more than 20. But you can see here that the black steel stops at 199, but the well goes down to 260. So from 199 to 260, it's just an open hole that was drilled in the bedrock. And again, here, this is also under pressure. The static level is only 130, which means it's well up into above the limestone into the unconsolidated sand and boulders and clay, which is the glaciated material. But when they pumped it at 25 gallons a minute for 2 hours, it dropped to 160. So if you go back over to the left, number 5, they were only putting in a 12 gallon per minute pump. And so they know when they pumped it for 2 hours at 25 gallons a minute, it dropped to 160. And so they felt like putting the pump at 160 would be sufficient for the use of how that well was going to be used for the camp. And they shouldn't have a problem with the water level dropping below the pump. The nice thing to know either way is that if there was a problem, they still have, and this was mainly to keep it up in the casing. So if you go down into the formation, then you might be getting fines or other things that you're stirring up, or sloughing off of the bedrock itself if it's friable. And so if ideally they want to keep the pump up into the casing if they could, so they could go down to 199 or so if they had a problem. Okay. So what are our concerns about all this? Really, and understanding our well is really goes back to these things: public health protection, source water protection. The things you do with your well or how it's done or whether it's not properly abandoned can all affect the aquifer. People do things all the time that they don't realize may be contaminating not only their well, but also their neighbor's well. And it's also, too, about protecting water quality in general. And so given those are our concerns, you hear all kinds of things in the news. Drought, how that affects things. It does. Flooding does, too. Contamination, now PFAS is the big thing. It was lead. It's been other things in the past. All those things certainly matter. I'm not saying that, but they're all symptoms, and they're a specific case of issues that can affect the well. This particular well, it's on my drive. My mom, she's 92, bless her heart, lives about an hour and a half from me, and this is on the road I take to go visit her. Those trees are along a small creek, and it's in a bottom ground, and so there's sand and gravel available there. Off to the left, you can't see, are two large hog confinement units, and this well supplies those. And so to get around the problem of flooding, where if it could overtop the casing and maybe contaminate the well, they just ran the casing up to, I think it's about 12 feet. And so you have to have a pretty tall rig to work on this, or pump truck, but it's certainly doable, and that's what they managed to do. That prevents, even if this were to flood, which I'm sure, at least every 3 or 4 years, this entire bottom is full of water. We see a lot of that these days. The well's not going to get overtopped, and as long as it's constructed properly and it's grouted properly around the well casing, then it won't be a problem. Drought is an issue because when water levels lower, especially below historic levels, now you've exposed an area of the geology, the aquifer unit itself, to air that maybe it never has been exposed to. When metals get oxidized, they leach out. And so a lot of times when water levels drop significantly, those wells can start leaching metals and into the water. And so all these things, again, are important. Non-regulated drinking water, that's a term somebody was using for a while. Private wells aren't regulated, but to get a national program to sample or regulate private wells, one will never fly because there's too many people that don't want to be regulated, and it's too variable across the country. So it's just a term I thought was interesting that tried to get some legs a number of years ago, and the other talking about private wells. But anyway, that went through a news cycle or two. And boil orders. Boil orders are associated with a community water supply. That typically a main break, a water main breaks somewhere, and they have to repair it. Well, anytime the system loses pressure and there's potential for water to get in to the distribution system from a break, then everybody downstream of that has to boil their water. And so why would that be a problem for a private well? I bring this up because this is about what well owners know and don't know. If that's on the radio or in the newspaper, I've had so many small system water operators tell me that, oh yeah, I always get calls from the private well owners within like a mile or two of our village asking if they need to boil their water. And that's really just a lack of understanding of what a boil order is for and how their well is different, and then the water supply to a community water supply. And so I throw that in here just because my real thing, and what I consider the two biggest issues for private well owners, are poor construction, which we have so many wells that are poorly constructed aren't protective at the surface. These are two of them. We did a project in Illinois where we sampled a lot of dug and bored wells, and these are two that we were sampling. But that wood top isn't protective in any way. Bugs, snakes, larger critters, anything can get in there. Anything can get poured over top of that wood, and by accident, and you set a bucket of something on top of it and knock it over. It's not properly sealed, plain and simple. And so many problems we find with well water quality end up being because of poor construction. And the other is lack of well owner knowledge and education. That's why I brought up the boil orders. So many people don't understand how to take care of their well, or even what kind of well they have, or know any of the specifics that we've talked about so far. It's important that they take it seriously and understand, and that's our job. I was just telling someone the other day, one of our communication people, PRI, they were like, we were explaining our program, and I'm like, if you could draw a line on a graph, a horizontal line, and say, this is the level of knowledge and education that well owners have, our job is try to raise that up. Even if it's a little bit, then we've succeeded in helping more folks understand how to be a better steward of their well and protect their well and their family and their aquifer from contamination. And so, to me, these are the two things that are most important to address as professionals. If we could get rid of both of these problems, a lot of other things would just go away, and they would. So, yeah, it's my dog and pony show for that, I guess. Yeah, so this second one, a colleague and I went there to help these folks. They were renting a house in the country. It was a single mom with two little kids. They had no idea about anything in the well. We went out to sample it and came back to fix this because there was frogs in our well from this, or toads, from this little hole that was there. They can sense the water, and yeah, and that's not an uncommon story at all. So it matters to identify those things, to look at your well every so often to make sure it hasn't been hit by a tractor, or your kid right in the riding mower hasn't broke the PVC or whatever it might be. We see where people even tie their dogs up on a chain to a well. Just bad practice to have anything in your well that might have a contamination associated with it, like dog poop. So as far as poor construction, it's not only an issue with surface contamination. This particular well is in a little well house. You can kind of see the side of the wall on the top of the picture, but they're also a safety hazard. And so for a while, Washington State Department of Ecology had a blog where they post pictures of different events. I'm going to show you several more. But in this case, this woman had a big piece of plywood over her old hand-dug well. Someone put this culvert in as the well casing. You can see the funnel there, probably to put oil in the pump. Looks like old gray insulation that's coming off the walls. Every time you're in there, you're kicking that in. All that stuff. Well, she stepped on that plywood and it broke that time, and it killed her. And that's not a rare story. And so the problem is, and there's no way around it, is that as well construction codes have came to be, like in Illinois, that was in 1968. In New York, it was 2000. I think it was 86 in Nebraska, just for a couple examples. All the wells that already existed were grandfathered in. And so, like the well I grew up on, it was hand dug in 1933. The RCAP folks are doing these assessments, especially out east. RCAP Solutions is working in Massachusetts and Maine and some of those areas that have been part of our country a lot longer than some of us. They find wells that are well over 100, 150 years old that are still in use. And some of those are in great shape, and some are like this. So some of these wells too, I mentioned pits. Before a pitless adapter, which we'll talk about later too, in an area that has a freeze line, like here in Illinois, in the winter, soil freezes down to 2 or 3 feet. Further north, it's much more than that. Well, in order to keep pipes from freezing in the winter, you had to have your well down below the frost line. And so you had a well that was in a pit. Well, if it rained really hard, that pit could fill up. And unless your well seal or your well caps was perfectly sealed, that's going to introduce surface contamination into your well. And so we're trying to get rid of those pits as well. We still see them. But yeah, there's a lot of those kind of problems that are out there. I don't know what just happened here. I didn't realize this was a. Yeah, I borrowed this slide from Aaron Huggett, who worked on this program for a while and is now getting a PhD. But we were sent the picture on the left, and from Joe is in Wyoming, and because the water's warmer than the air, all those garter snakes are just hovering over on that pipe because it's warmer, and a number of those snakes managed to get down that hole that goes directly into the well. So not ideal. We've had folks on these webinars contact us and say, hey, I went out to my dad's, his water smelled funny. We opened up his old well and you could just see the snakes crawling around the bottom. And all that happens. They're looking for water, they're looking for warmth. And here on the right, that conduit that she mentions is what is for the electrical line. And that's supposed to be connected to the well cap, the red monitor cap there. And obviously it's not, so anything can fall in there. It's just, got to maintain a seal at the surface so that you don't have to worry about risk of surface contamination. So what should you do? Bring them up to code if you have a code. It's not required you bring up the code. You might even want to use a code from a different state. If you're in Pennsylvania and Alaska, where you don't have well code, you want to use somewhere else. Use Illinois. It's a pretty good code. Drillers have an input in it as well as help folks. But your well should look kind of like this. And even this picture isn't perfect because we really would recommend that you mound a little bit around your well and have it higher in elevation right at the wellhead so that water's running away. And this one does not do that. But it should be up above on a flat area. If it's at all prone to flooding, then there's a gasket that holds that cap. It makes that watertight. Those gaskets, especially in cold climate, get brittle. I've opened many wells where there's only half a gasket there. Well, if that ever gets flooded or water overtops it, it's going to get in the well. You're going to have potential for E. coli problems at least, if not something else. So if you have a well in a pit, upgrade it. Bring up put the pipe to the surface, put in a pitless adapter, and it should be sticking out of the ground like this and sealed around the well casing. It's called the annulus. It's the area between the hole you drill and the size of the casing. There's a little gap, and you fill that with clay or cement grout so that water can't move through that and get down to where your screen is or where it can get into the aquifer. Same with abandoned wells. We find abandoned wells all the time that no one knew existed. Here's two examples again from the Washington State Department of Ecology. In the upper one, they're pulling a horse out of an old well that was just in the pasture where it was been. And the one on the bottom, the Shelton, Washington man, he was walking in his backyard and he fell through. Very lucky. Someone hurt him, calling for help. Fire department came, got him out. He walked away. Like I said, super lucky, right? But we find these all the time. I know on our website, we have a well demonstration, a well sealing demonstration video, and it's in the middle of a town, actually Macomb, Illinois, that has 16,000 people, 4 blocks from downtown. They've had public water since 1916. Someone bought a house 4 blocks from downtown and realized they had this thing on this concrete pad with a little hole in it right on the outside of their porch, on their back porch, right next to the foundation. And it was an old 22-foot, I think, hand dug well. And that little hole had been where a hand pump had been, and eventually it had rusted away. And so we participated with a number of others in a Groundwater Guardians group and Western Illinois University's geology department and a driller who donated a lot of his time and some resources to making a field day out of it for all the county health departments in the area. And we made a well sealing demonstration and videoed it and have it on our website. But there was, no one knew it was a well there, and it's been there, it had to be over 100 years old. And what's interesting is when we took the lid off, the big concrete pad, all the drop pipe for that hand pump was laying down in it, as well as about, I'm just going to randomly guess, 10 to 20,000 cigarette butts and a couple lighters. So that little 2.5-inch hole that used to have the hand pump, the last homeowner decided that was a great ashtray. And so, yeah, out of sight, out of mind. But those are the kinds of problems you deal with. And I just wanted to show this because this isn't a new phenomena. These newspaper clippings are all from the 90s. The third one, especially for those of you old enough, remember when CNN covered a day and a half or 2 days of folks trying to rescue this little girl in Midland, Texas, who got caught in a well. She was 18 months old. It took over a day, I know. But they got her out. She's now a mother of 3. But you didn't hear about those things in the past because they ended up in a newspaper. And even in different parts of Illinois, these other 3, the first, second, and the fourth one, are from different parts of the state. Galesburg's in the west. Buffalo Grove's a Chicago suburb, and Springfield is kind of south central, state capital. And people died from falling these things, and you just don't. There wasn't the internet. There wasn't. You didn't cover local things like that as well. You got a news feed from your national office or whatever. So it's a real thing. It happens more than people realize. There we go. I didn't edit this like I thought I did. So going back to this, we're talking about aquifers and aquatards. And so really, the upper 2 on each column are aquifers, and the bottom 2 are aquatards. Or if it's completely sealed, where it's just solid rock, you could say it's an aquiclude, which means it doesn't let any water through. But even an aquatard, it retards flow, but there's still some leakage, as I showed in that example before. And so, an aquifer really is a geologic unit that has enough water that when you put a well in it, it can continuously pump a sufficient quantity. If it can't, then it's not an aquifer. It may have water in it. Like if I dig a post hole here in Champaign County, there's places where the water table is only 3 or 4 feet. If I drill a 7-foot hole or put in a 7-foot hole for a post, the bottom of it's going to have water in it, but that's slowly seeping through the silt and clay. If I put a pump in it, it'd go dry in 30 seconds. And so that's the difference. And so when we talk about aquifers, we're talking about something that will provide a continuous source of water. And going back to this, what was my point here? I had one. Just, it really matters how deep you are and what kind of unit you're in, but it can, how much water is available really just depends on how water is moving through the system, I guess. And aquifers can be of 2 types. It can be unconfined, which means they're not full. Is the best way to explain that. It has a free surface. So near a river valley is typically where you see this. Maybe it's sand right at the surface. So in our Mason County, Illinois, there's about 120 feet of sand over bedrock. The sand is saturated until in some places it's between 4 and 40 feet, depending on the landscape. So there's 100 to less than 60 feet of completely saturated sand. But it all has a free surface where it's dry in the sand above that water table surface. And when it's all sand like that, it's like still an aquifer, but it's unconfined, which means the waters that are at atmospheric pressure at the top. We're in a confined aquifer, like the examples we showed with our 2 well logs. When water level rises up above the top of the aquifer, it's confined, it's got pressure on it, and so it's artesian. It means that the water level is higher than the actual aquifer top of it itself. And if it ends up flowing out of the well, then that's considered a flowing artesian aquifer. But it doesn't have to flow to be artesian. It just means it's under higher than atmospheric pressure. And it matters because when you take a gallon of water out of an unconfined aquifer, it's lowering the water level in the aquifer. When you take a gallon of water out of a confined aquifer, you're taking a foot of head or so off the pressure, but the aquifer is still completely full. And so how that affects drawdown changes a lot when you go from confined to unconfined or vice versa, and how much pumping at a given rate, say 100 gallons a minute, is very different in those two. So as an example, so we'll call this Mason County. There's a water table, there's 2 wells. Part of it's full of water, part of it's not. This is all sand. The water level's flat across the whole thing. In a confined aquifer, there's an aquitard. And so you have 2 wells here that have different water levels. So the upper well, the unconfined one, is the water table, and that just happens to be sand, so it's also an aquifer. Where the bottom one, it's confined and it's under pressure, but the water level in the well doesn't come all the way up to the other aquifer. It's somewhere in the middle, so to speak. And so that's the pressure on the system is the difference there. And the aquifer stays full when you start to pump it because it lowers the water level. Unless the water level drops below the top of the confined aquifer, it's still confined and it's still completely full. As an example for confined aquifers, so here we have, and this is just a simplified drawing. I know it looks different than everything else, but I like it, so I use it. There's a water table above the confined aquifer, and the water level in this aquifer is where that triangle is in the black there. It can either be below the water table, it can be above the water table, or it can be enough pressure that it's actually flowing. And we have areas in Illinois. There's a lot of areas in Michigan where this happens, or seasonally. When I was first working here and dating myself in the late 80s, we had 13 inches of rain in a week up in Kankakee County, which is an area where there's a shallow sand over top of bedrock, and most of the wells are in the bedrock. But there's a direct rainfall can directly get into that. It caused this huge spike in pressure, and we saw a bunch of wells that are being used for irrigation up there that are just they're using like a movable pump on the back of a tractor for vegetables, not a big center pivot irrigation system. And we started seeing all these wells start flowing. And that was just because of all the increased rainfall, and the entire water cycle was overloaded, if you will. And so a good example of that is from here. And I forgot to put the source on here, I apologize. We made this, but we adapted it from another document. I believe it's from Iowa. But, in reality, geology isn't flat. It doesn't exist horizontally. And so in this case, and this could be 100 miles across, but you have an unconfined aquifer with a water table near a stream. Then you move into the uplands. The upper confining layer and the confined aquifer below eventually may come to the surface somewhere. And so that's the recharge area for the aquifer. And it's because of that, on the very right there, where you see the dashed line, that is the water level. That's why you see the artesian well, the next thing to the left, has a water level that's that high. The water table well, the next one to the left, is only in the water table, so it's going to follow that. And that's because the stream is a discharge point. So the stream kind of keeps control of how much water can be in there. When the stream floods, water comes up higher in the water table. In Mason County, we had so much flooding in '93 that about 10,000 lakes formed. And they were actually, the groundwater level was above land surface in some of the low-lying areas. And so it's really just, there's too much water and no place for it to go. But on the flowing artesian well, it's in that deeper aquifer, but it's all under the same pressure. And if you look at those dashed lines, the way they drop down to the well, that's just to show for effect. If you could put another piece of pipe on top of that well, it would be this dashed across, straight across, because that's it's an instantaneous pressure movement, so to speak. And so it's causing water to flow towards a low spot. And because this well is releasing water at a lower pressure elevation, or a lower pressure total, like PSI, water's flowing towards that well so it can discharge. And so it's complicated, but it all makes sense when you hopefully when you put it all together. And hopefully I haven't botched that too much. But the controls on the system are typically your streams or some point of discharge, and that's what makes this all part of the hydrologic cycle, and why every time it rains, you don't necessarily see things change. Like our deeper aquifer here in sand and gravel, because of all the clay, not only is it protected, but it also doesn't get much recharge. So we don't see effects of drought or flooding on our deeper sand and gravel aquifer here in Champaign County, because it's kind of protected and insulated from those things. It take a lot to have that start to affect it, a lot of increased pumpage or other things. As an example of pumpage, in the Chicago area, there's, I don't know, 5 million people that live in the Chicago metro area, or 6, something like that. All the pumpage in the deep aquifers, and these elevations are actually mean sea level elevation. So the land surface is around 750 to 650. And you can see some of these wells are minus 1,000 feet elevation at 1,600 feet. There's two sand and gravel, or I'm sorry, there are two sandstone aquifers that provide a lot of the water to that area, and they get heavy pumpage. And so that red dashed line are the water levels in that aquifer from continuous pumping by utilities, public water systems. And Elmhurst is the low spot. So at Elmhurst, water is actually flowing in the St. Peter and the Ironton Galesville towards Elmhurst in both directions, like the arrows show. And that's again because of pressure. It's flowing towards lowest pressure. It doesn't matter whether it's got to go up or not. It's again just like the juice box. It doesn't go up the straw naturally, but it will if I put enough pressure on it. And that's what's happening here. It's flowing from high pressure to low, and you can see how that's affected things. This aquifer had lost nearly 1,000 feet of water level, these two deep aquifers, until Chicago went on Lake Michigan water back in the 80s. And a lot of it's recovered. There's still a few large communities that still use it. And so we still see some pretty big cones of depression up there. But the way they were going before they went to Lake Michigan water, eventually they would have ran out of water for the Chicago area. So it's pretty interesting. But it's just an example of how pumpage can affect flow direction, all that stuff. And so looking at this, there's two different parts of this. At the top, it's showing like a slice through it, like if you were down in the ground looking straight out towards a well, and you can see, this 80 or 100 feet of geology. So when you pump a well, you can see how the water level drops down. In this case, it's showing it. And again, this is an old diagram, but it does the job. And so we haven't tried to change this. But you have drawdown at the well, it's most, and then water's trying to fill in, so water's rushing to the well from all directions. And if this were perfectly uniform sand, and the water level was completely, like this shows the water table being completely flat when it started, the bottom is a line of equal elevation. So they're concentric lines of drawdown that match the diagram on top. So at the well, that's at 400 feet mean sea level. Out on the edge, it's at 460. So it's 60 feet of drawdown at the well. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. And so in an idealized case, again, which the world isn't, these would be concentric circles, a drawdown. It'd be a perfect cone of depression, just like a cone, like really, yeah, it'd just be, that's what it'd look like. It's all radial flow because it can get to it in all directions, and that's what it'd look like. Now, if I have two wells, now the water, the well on the left can't get as much water on the right side of it because the other well is also taking water. And so that's what this looks like. Wells can interfere with each other. If they're pumping hard enough, they can actually cause one or the other not to pump anymore, where the pumps are set and all that stuff. And so there's an entire engineering firms, when they design a well field for a large utility, like Champaign-Urbana has maybe 16 or 20 wells in use, they do an analysis to make sure that they've spaced these far enough away from each other that you're not going to have interference from one to the other. For a private well, that only comes into play if you're in an area where there's very low flow. Like if you're, there's areas I know in Pennsylvania where some of the wells only pump maybe 1 or 2 gallons a minute or less. Or we worked with a gentleman in the Rockies where his well only pumped a half gallon a minute. And that doesn't cut it when you're taking a shower. So he had to put in, I think it's a 2,500 gallon cistern. So he pumps water basically continuously into a cistern, and then from there pumps it into his home when he needs it. But the same thing, those are extreme cases. For most private wells, nearly all, you'd never have this interference problem. But again, we're trying to get at how all this works and how the hydrology and hydraulics work, so you understand where your water's coming from. If there's a barrier on one edge or the other, obviously there's no water. If the sand and gravel runs up against bedrock, then that bedrock is the edge of your aquifer. So it's going to try to pull as much water from all directions, but the water levels are going to lower more because there's nothing to replenish it further off the map, if you will. So on the right side, the aquifer extends further to the right, and it can keep pulling water in. towards the well, where you're running out of resource on the left side. And so that's how it elongates that cone of depression. And then if you have the opposite problem, you have a well down in a river valley and the sand's directly connected to the river. The river acts as a constant head. It's not going to change because of one well pumping. It might be, if it's a large river, it, who knows how many billions of gallons are running through it a day. Pumping a well even 1,000 gallons a minute isn't going to change the water level in that river. And so it acts as a constant source. And so you see it doesn't move past the river. The cone of depression doesn't extend further away. And on the other side of the river, you don't even notice it. You look at the bottom diagram, you can see that, water is usually flowing downhill towards the discharge point, and here that is the river. And so the water levels in that aquifer go up as you get further away from the river because it's all running into the river to discharge. Okay, so a number of states have tools like this one. I just show ours because I know it best. But I know Wisconsin has a great viewer. There's a couple other states that do, where you can find your well information, basically. And I encourage everyone to do that. So when you get in our state geological survey, they're our sister agency. We work together, we share logs, all that stuff. But they've developed this viewer. And so here I'm in Champaign County. The area that's colored is the outline of the Muhammad Aquifer, which is buried sand and gravel. And so as I zoom in near our airport on the south side of town, this is actually, you can almost see my house in this picture. I'm just northeast of the airport. But if I click on a well, it gives me this information. This is how the Geological Survey stores their records. It was drilled in 1959. It's 269 feet deep. And that's really what's there. But if I click on the API number, then that gives me this generated log. That's not the actual log that the driller filed. It's from the information that was input into a database. But you can see they tried to go past the sand and gravel, and they got into this compact coal, brown clay. So they're right at the top of the bedrock there, and so they basically stopped. But there's a fair amount of sand and clay. This is all glacial material that's been deposited. And yeah, so if you look at, there were 3 logs there. If you didn't notice, I can go back. This said 2 of 3 on the little box. And so if I go to another one of the logs, it's only 169 feet deep. It's in the sand and gravel. And we've linked, the water survey scans the logs. The GeoSurvey has everything generated through this viewer. And so if you want to see the actual log, then for this particular well, we have that information. And we're working on this slowly because we don't have funding for it. But we're slowly putting these in. And if I click on that, it gives me this scan of the actual log that was in our files that provides the other information. It's a working head 3/4 horse pump. The water level is 91.6 feet. From ground level, they pumped it at 15 gallons a minute for 2 hours, and it dropped to 117. They have it looks like that they put a concrete pit in, and then it's from 4 to 162. It's a drilled well in sand. I don't see. Oh yeah, 7-foot slotted screen. So it doesn't say the diameter here. Oh, it's 2.5 inches. So we run across a number of these that were drilled before the 70s and 80s that are these really small wells that today you'd never put in because having a pump, use a lot more pumps, submersible pumps today. They used to use more jet pumps that are the pumps at the surface, and it's pulling water that way. Still, it's a way to get to that information. So that's what I have related to the geology and well types and all that information. I want to talk a little bit. I must have talked more today. I'm sure Sally and Katie can let me know that after that I did. Excuse me. But I want to talk quickly, at least about the private well class. It's really the answer to what can I do to help private well owners understand their wells better. And so that's how we look at it. And so it's not only these webinars, but it's these 10 lessons I mentioned. They're self-paced. You receive it as a PDF and an email. You're on your own to read it. We do ask that you take a pre-test and a post-test. You don't have to. They're voluntary. And then we have an evaluation that shows up after that. But there's a lot of great information in these lessons. It's a lot more detailed. And so this is our webpage. It's just privatewellclass.org. And from that, you can click on enroll in class, and it takes you to this page. And it really, again, as I mentioned before, it's what you can do to learn and care for your well and ensure your water's safe. When you click on enroll, you get this page. The location is just what state you're in, and that's really as much for our funder to show them that we're actually working all over the country as anything else. But we obviously need your email in order to send you the information. And so there's a Spanish version. If you're a professional and you're in a county or local health area where there may be a lot of native Spanish speakers on wells, encourage them to take the class here. It's not used that much, but it's there and it's available, and it certainly has been. And we even had a young man here at the University of Illinois in civil engineering on a Fulbright scholarship from Columbia, and he made it his personal mission to redo our entire class in Spanish, including the figures. And so this is just one page out of the first section, lesson 1, talking about the hydrologic cycle and how water gets from the surface down into an aquifer. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. For each lesson, we've got a series of supplemental resources, if you will. They all talk about the same topics, like in the science of groundwater is the porosity and permeability and some of those things, groundwater fundamentals. And so there's other resources here. If for some reason the lessons don't resonate with you, they're written more like they're conversational with someone, and that works for some people, not others. And so these resources are the ones that we handpicked that provide a lot of additional useful information related to these topics. Click on free webinars and you get this page. That's what you're on today. We list our webinars that are coming up, as well as then the ones we do more often, like this one we do several times, as we mentioned earlier. Some we don't do as often. But when we know, like how to find local help and information is coming up in June. And so you can look at the past ones, and they're also all available on YouTube. And so you can watch the entire webinar there. The thing is, like if this webinar today, the last time we gave it was in December, the questions at the end that Erin did that last one before she left, the questions that were asked and she answered are different than the questions that you all asked and I'm going to answer today. And so what I try to encourage people to do is, you don't want to watch that whole 2-hour and 13-minute webinar. Scroll to the end, near the end, the last 30 minutes or so, where the questions are, and there's a lot of useful information in those. If you've been through this webinar, you don't need to go through the material again, per se, unless you want to. But they're all available. And again, the questions, we try not to answer the same questions every month, just because it's different people, they have different kinds of questions, all that sort of stuff. And then we list, some of these are one-offs. We did one on well water chemistry with our lab lead here. We did one with PFAS. We brought in 2 experts who've done a lot of PFAS work from North Carolina. And so like if I click on that one, it tells me it's Jackie McDonald Gibson and Jennifer Hopnick Redmond. They just did this last May, but it's available on YouTube. And there's that video, and that's Jennifer talking about. It was really good. I mean, I think we had 400 or 500 people on that because it's it's a concern, right? PFAS is a concern for one, and they've done a lot of field work sampling homes with wells in different areas to try to get at causes and some of those things. So I know there was at least 1 or 2 PFAS questions I don't think I did answer today, but I would encourage you to go to this May webinar from last May and watch that to get a better idea. It includes as well what they recommend for treatment, and that's what we would recommend. They're the experts. And so it really talks about the levels, and there's really 2 types of treatment that you can use in a home. And so I would direct you to that. We have a set of training videos. What's an artesian well? What's an aquifer? What's a sand and gravel well? So we have these training videos. They're all 4 to 6 minutes long. They go over some of these basic concepts, and there's really about one thing. And so they're pretty helpful. I guess I thought I had another slide there. We have one that's how does my pressure tank works? It's had like 450,000 views. And it tells us that a lot of people have pressure problems and don't necessarily understand their pressure tank. And also that there's not a lot of great information out there on how a pressure tank does work. And so this is a short video talks about, your setting your low and high pressure for when your pump should kick on. Some of that's going away because now we have variable speed pumps, and we have pressure tanks that instead of being 60 to several hundred gallons are now just 1 or 2 gallons to help get the system started, and your pump is creating pressure in your system depending on how much use you have. It's more efficient. Your pump doesn't run as much. There's a lot of reasons why it's going that way. Just technology's advanced, but obviously a lot of older homes or folks who've lived in the same home for a while still have the old type of pressure tank, and so it's an issue. So we started a help center. I meant to change this slide. We're not calling it a hotline, at least I'm not anymore, because it's a lot more than a phone number. But Sarah and Sally run this. Sally really was hired to manage this and developed a lot of the articles that are in this tool. So you can, on our front page, which showing the top of the front page here at the bottom, one of the things you can click on is Visit Help Center. So when you do, it takes you to this page, and you can look at these articles. There's about 150 of them. The article title is a question. The article body is the answer. And so you can search that way. A lot of people don't call us anymore because they're going through these articles and they're finding the answers they need. And in fact, what's happened is now the phone calls and emails we get are about much more complicated problems, which is good and bad. It takes a lot more work to try to solve in some cases, but that's allowed us to have the time to do some of those things. And so you can call us, you can email us at help@privatewellclass.org, or you can even, if it's off hours, when Sally and Sarah aren't here, you can ask our bot, if you will. It's only using our materials. It's not searching the web for anything. We put all the webinars transcripts, all of our class lessons, all of our articles it searches. So it's only the information that we provide, and it's consistent. And actually, it's interesting, it gives better answers. So like on this webinar, I may answer, I'm not doing it today, but if I answered a specific question about PFAS, it's going to be really geared towards the wording of that question. Well, I may have answered another question that is similar but not the same 4 months ago or 12 months ago. This then takes all three of those answers and combines it and gives you a much more complete answer. I was really surprised at how well it does. And again, it's because it's not connected to the internet. It's only using our material to do that. So if I search for flooding, for instance, it'll give you a number of different results. Top one is my well safe after a flood. Well, there's a number of things that matter, whether it's been overtopped. Oh, I thought I had another slide there. But you can search that. It actually goes back to one of those short videos that we made. It's like 4 minutes long about what you need to be concerned with flooding in a well. We also have a podcast called drinkingwaterpodcast.org. Actually, it's called Tap Talk, the Drinking Water in Rural America podcast. We interview folks at the kind of the intersection of rural health and water, whether that's small communities, whether it's water or wastewater, septic, or private wells. So, for instance, Aaron Ling runs a private well program in Virginia, at West Virginia University. No, Virginia Tech, I'm sorry. The folks, Andrew and Emily, run a company that specializes in biofilms in water. They work both with private well owners and communities, and the two on top are both on the public well side. Matt Moss runs a training center for operators, and Tammy is the state lead in Alaska for community water supplies. And she started out in her little village in a rural part of Alaska as the operator, and now she runs the state's program. So we've had, I just handpicked a few here. I think episode 77 drops tomorrow. They're on a variety of topics. I encourage you to go look that up. That's just drinkingwaterpodcast.org. And so all of that we do really has these goals: to help well owners understand why their well is important, why they should understand how it works, and how that all helps them protect themselves and their family from any risk and water quality issues. And so that's kind of where we're at. And our program has done nothing but grow, which we feel very fortunate. For instance, I don't think I put a slide in for it, but we're holding our 6th National Private Well Conference, which is for professionals. It's next week. We're all leaving over the weekend to head to Missoula, Montana. There's over 100 professionals who are going to be there for 3 days, 26 talks, and it's an opportunity for us to bring people together that can share information on what they're doing in their area. Some are local health districts, some are county extension agents, some are work at universities, a number of regulators. Like I mentioned, Wisconsin has this really great viewer. They have one for wells. They also have one to show all the water quality analysis they've done on private wells. And one of the folks from Wisconsin is coming to show that viewer with water quality. You can go to their webpage and get in this map viewer and zoom in on the county and see what the water quality is for a bunch of constituents, from E. coli to nitrate to arsenic to whatever. And so it's to show others around the country what's available and what can be done. And hopefully we, again, all go back home and raise awareness in our areas, or work to find ways to work together to improve those in places that don't have those things. And so going to the questions, I didn't answer as many questions today, mainly because honestly, we're getting ready for our conference and we didn't have as much time to prepare. And a big thank you to Sally for stepping in and putting the draft, at least, of the questions today, or most of them. And so if we don't get to your questions, especially the ones that were just asked, because Katie sends us the questions that everybody asks usually 3 or 4 days or more in advance, so we can prepare answers. We do have a question box or maybe you have a chat box on your GoToWebinar window. You can ask questions in there. She's putting those in a Google Doc that we share. And once I'm done with these questions, I think there's 6, we'll pull up that Google Doc and answer questions until there aren't any more, until you want to leave. But yeah. So first question. I don't really understand what a pitless adapter is and how it works with the wellhead completion. So as I mentioned before, it's a way to have a frost-free connection, so that it used to be that the pipe from your pump that comes up to the surface came all the way out the top of your well, but in a cold climate, that would freeze in the winter when when water's not freely flowing through it. And so they developed this thing called a pitless adapter that actually connects to your discharge line that's horizontal going to your home, down at depth. And so you can have a straight pipe for your well that comes all the way up to the surface, but the pipe that pushing or pulling the water out doesn't come up to the surface. It turns down at 3 or 4 feet and goes into the home. And so you don't have to worry about freezing anymore. The well I grew up on was in a little well house, but when it get down to 0 below, our pipes were exposed. It wasn't a heated well house. It was just this little concrete thing my grandpa had made. So we had a propane tank, a little portable one we kept down there, and we had to go down in the evening and run it and hope, make sure that the propane was full and all that stuff, so that those pipes didn't freeze overnight. It's a real pain when you're a kid to have your dad tell you at 2 a.m. to go out and change change that tank, because he's worried it's going to run out. Yeah, that was many moons ago. This is what they look like. So it's either a pitless unit or a pitless adapter. Basically, though, you see the lift out device is just a pipe connecting to the whole assembly, and it'll just lift out. And the discharge line is spring loaded, and so it can pop off, and it allows you to pull your pump out without having to disconnect anything down in the well. It snaps in place, and yeah, they're really handy. It's the bottom line. They were invented, I believe, in the early 60s, maybe late 50s. And so we did a study with, I hired 5 geology students to go out and inventory all the wells in 9 townships in a rural area of Illinois. They found 1,700 wells. We only had logs for 788 of them, which tells you how old a lot of them are. But there were at least 40 that were still in a pit. And so, we really shouldn't have wells and pits anymore. They can flood, all those things that I mentioned before. Those caps aren't necessarily perfectly sealed as they should be. And so, yeah, this is what it does. And so land surface is now another 3 or 4 feet above this. And you can see where it shows the frost line. And so long as we're below that, you don't have to worry about your pipes freezing. Or worse, a full pipe can burst. We did have that happen at home. Yeah. How can I monitor the water level in my well? Well, so this picture I'm showing is for a diagram that we made from a diagram from Oregon. Oregon's the only state that requires a piezometer tube, which is that little small tube that does nothing else, but it's like a 1-inch PVC tube that has a little screen on the bottom of it, and so that you can drop something down there to measure the water level. And so I think every state should have this as part of their construction, personally, because now we're taking a well cap off, and anytime you take a well cap off, you could introduce potential for bacteria or something else to get in the well. And so this piezometer tube is specifically for that. But that's one thing you can do. There's also devices like what we do when we're trying to, we'll do a project where we need to know all the water levels so we can make a potentiometric surface map and show water flow direction and all that stuff. We get permission from a well owner, a homeowner, and we do take the cap off. We disinfect everything. But we drop either an electric drop line, and it looks like a measuring tape, but it's got two little wires on it and a little stainless steel thing at the end that as soon as it hits water, it beeps. It creates a connection. So it beeps on the device, and it's graduated like a tape measure, and so we can tell exactly where the water level is based on the depth that it's at compared to your measuring point, which is typically the top of the well casing. There's also, now they've developed some of these devices that like ping a signal down the well, and based on how quickly it returns, it's been calibrated to tell you what the water level is. I've never used one of those. If there's any kind of interference from, you have spacers keeping your pump in the center of the well, or there's an extra thick thing of wiring above the pump because they're afraid they might have to lower it someday and they don't want to have to replace all the wiring. Then how that affects those things, I don't know. But the other thing you can do is just hire a contractor. I mean, that's going to cost some money, but they should know how to do it the right way to measure water level. If you're talking about doing it regularly, then you want to maybe consider. The company that makes the electric drop lines we use is called Solus. I don't know if there are other companies, or I'm certainly not advertising for them, but we've used those for years, and they're pretty amazing. The only thing I will tell you is, because you have a pump in your well, if you do, and because there could be spacers, and because there's wiring, you always run a risk of dropping something down your well to get a water level measurement, and it gets stuck. We use steel tapes when I had those geology students working for me. We use steel tapes without anything on the end, and these are only maybe 3/8 of an inch wide, and it's steel. They're specially made, and they had nothing on the end, so it seems like there's no way they could get connected or caught up on something. We had two get hung up. We measured about 500 water levels during that project, and I had to hire a contractor to pull the pump to get the tape out, and, because the well owner didn't want to leave the tape in their well, and I don't blame him. So there's drawbacks to all that, but it's certainly possible. So yeah, and there may be more things out there today than I'm even aware of. I know now they even make well caps that have a little hand pump on them. So when your power goes out, you can basically hand pump your well without having to take the cap off. And I haven't reviewed any of those or considered how well they work, but anything mechanical, anything additional, it needs to have a good purpose. I know growing up, we were in the middle of nowhere. Like the ice storm in 1976, I'm dating myself, I was a kid. We were without power for 7 days. So without a generator, we'd have been really in trouble. But again, having an option for water is, especially if livestock, which we did, makes a difference. So, what's the safe distance of a well near an active landfill area? So there is no set safe distance, as far as we can't give you a number, and it really depends on the landfill. For one, when was it constructed? Was it after all the rules were in place, so it has clay or some kind of impermeable fabric underneath it? We know those get punctured just the same. If it's an older landfill, then it could be leaching. Depends on the geology. If it's in Champaign County here, and there's 80 feet of clay, and the landfill only goes down maybe 20 feet into the ground, and you still have 60 feet of clay in theory. That matters. The other thing that really matters the most, though, is the flow direction. And the only way to know flow direction is to measure water levels in a number of wells in the same aquifer, equate that to mean sea level, so you know the actual elevation. And from that, you can determine what direction water is flowing. Because, as I mentioned this several times, water flows downhill. From that respect, it also depends on your well. Is your well, is it 250 feet with a screen? Is it, what's the situation? Because, as I mentioned before, even with pesticides applied near a well, depending on the well construction and where your water's coming from, it may not really be a factor. But if you know the flow direction, if, for instance, if the flow is flowing from your well towards the landfill, that means water's flowing away from you at the landfill. It's flowing down gradient away some other direction. Someone on the other side of the landfill would have a concern. But if it's flowing towards you, or if it's kind of flowing in a direction that doesn't, either way, landfills are regulated heavily. Surely they have monitoring wells. I know I've looked at data from a number of landfills in Illinois, where I can get that data from our Illinois EPA, which is our primacy agency, and does all the RECLA, CERCLA, hazardous, underground storage tanks, all that stuff. They have to regulate all that. And I've been able to look at some of that data. I had to go over there to do it. But if you can find monitoring well data, there's probably an engineering report that talks about the flow direction. And that would give you a lot of comfort anyway, to know that the water's flowing from you towards the landfill versus from the landfill toward you. So that's my best answer today. But it hopefully gives you some direction. Because if you're up gradient, so water's flowing towards the landfill from you, there should be no issue, even if you're only a few hundred feet away, depending on pumpage. Because if you pump enough, you obviously lower the water level around your well, and that could change the flow direction. But all those things matter. It's not something we can just give you a definitive answer as a bottom line. What are the treatment system options for different contaminants? So this is a great general question, because Minnesota has this really great report that they developed. Well, it's not a report, it's a guide. So a few years ago, and Minnesota Health Department is really one of the premier state health departments in the country. The residents of Minnesota passed a referendum, probably 25 years ago now, where they agreed to pay a tax in order to help fund environmental stewardship. And so some of that money makes its way to the Department of Health to do more with their resources, like making a guide like this that I've never seen from any other state. If you just Google MDH for Minnesota Health Department or Department of Health, home water treatment, you'll find this document. And it's the most comprehensive thing that I know of. And we refer a lot of people to it. And it's really great. And it even talks about, if you look on that slide, NSF, the Gold Seal, and UL. Well, there's another certifier too. It's IAPMO, which is a plumbing group. So they're third-party certifiers that test treatment equipment to make sure it does what it says it's going to do. And the one thing I can tell you, if you're going to add any treatment, if it doesn't have one of those symbols or an IAPMO symbol, I'm saying that wrong. I can't remember. It's international. I can get you that if you email us. But they're the groups that a company has to pay them to run a challenge set of water through this treatment, and it has to do what it says it does. So like some of the filters out today for lead, they're amazing. They're only certified to like 150 ppb. Some of the testing that US EPA did on those when all the Flint stuff happened and the big lead stuff hit the fan in the mid 2010s, show that they're taking out 5 times that or more, down to a level that is much lower than what communities have to do today anyway. So that's the one thing I'll say here. But if you go to its tables are set up in 2 ways. One is by contaminant. So if you're just having taste, odor, and color issues, there's things that do that, like a carbon filter. If it's, arsenic, then and it's got caveats on all that. The reason arsenic, yeah. So it's a lot of good information. And then then for each of those treatment options, they give you a description, why it's great, why it's not. One thing I'll mention is for RO, there's really, I haven't run across a case where anyone needs to have a home wide, or it's POU is point of use, POE is point of entry. A POE means it does the whole house, like your softener does. POU would be like under your kitchen sink, so you have a tap just for your drinking water and cooking. Um, some folks we've talked to have been sold a POE RO unit. They don't need it. If you have arsenic problems, you use a point of use. You need a point of use RO. You can see the difference in costs there: 300 to 1,500 versus 5,000 to 12,000, and the maintenance costs. RO removes a lot of things, but it also generates wastewater. Um, it talks about all those things. In some of these, like ozonation or infiltration, that's more of an advanced process that you need to have someone with experience, which is why they say call a water treatment professional to get a quote. So, yeah, it's pretty handy. And that's the questions that we've answered today. And again, I apologize for not answering more. Um, if you want to email us, you'll get an email in an hour or two saying thanks for attending the webinar. You can always email us a question there too. With that, I want to, before we go, we need to find out the questions that folks have asked today. Okay, so I'm just going to make that full screen and then enlarge it real quick. Everybody should be able to see that. Okay, first question. I have a question about converting natural gas wells into water wells. Oh, wow. This area, southeast Kansas, has lots of semi-abandoned gas wells that go down 200, 250 feet. So water wells are usually only 100 feet deep. Water below 20 or so is often salty. Is it possible to half fill a well, fracture the casting, insert a permeable line, and pump water? I'm not the right person to answer that. The reason, if you're down in a gas storage area, it's because there's enough solid rock that it would maintain a gas dome. And we have areas in Illinois where we have salt water that's fairly shallow. I don't know if the salty is because of that. If there was oil exploration there and it causes some salt problems. It's not. I think you'd have to ask your state if it's even legal, whether they're abandoned or not. They're a different class of well. They're not a drinking water well. And I know there's a borehole there, but I don't know that you can do that. You'd have to work with the state of Kansas because there's different classes of wells. Like injection wells are class 5, I think they're class 3, but potable wells are ones that provide drinking water, and there's a lot of rules on that. We work with Kansas as a DHE a lot. I was just on a call yesterday with Brooklyn, if you know who that is. She's in the private well group. I'm sure she'd be willing to explain those things to you and get you her email address if you're interested. But it just doesn't seem like a great idea. Yeah, I just don't know enough about gas wells other than I know that they're all permitted differently. And so I don't know that that's a great idea. Okay, how can homeowners continuously monitor the water level in their well? Well, you could. So what we do, so I've drilled, I don't know, 50 or 60 monitoring wells that are still in place from the 90s. And all of those have pressure transducers in them. And that come up to the surface, and it converts the pressure to a feet of head, and it's got a phone attached to it and this little fancy box, and it sends it back to our system here, and you can go on our website and see the water level in a given well an hour ago or less. Every hour it takes a reading. And so certainly it's possible uh, if you want to do it that way. But it's not cheap. There's phone charges every month. Um, you know, we monitor the aquifers of the state. That's part of our job and our mission. And so we have monitoring wells throughout the state. I want to say we have over 200. Not all of those are outfitted that way. Some we measure with the old-fashioned Stevens recorder, which is a weight and pulley and a float on a chart, and some we only measure quarterly when someone goes out to either change the chart, excuse me, or to make sure the batteries and everything else are okay and calibrate the pressure transducers. So there's a number of options, and there's two of our staff here that do that work routinely. Um, one is the head of our groundwater group, and I'd be glad to put you in contact with them. But that's, you know, there's certainly ways to do that. Just I don't know. There's certainly situations where that might be helpful. Like I know with all the fracking stuff going on in Pennsylvania, there's some low flow areas where when you pump a well, even at a couple gallons a minute, it might drop the water level over 100 feet. You know, that's maybe where that would be an application that might be useful. But I think to actually do that continuously would require a pressure transducer in some sort of electronic system so that it could be recorded. Uh, and so you're looking at you're looking at one of those systems, even if it just hardwired uh, to your home computer without, you know, the phone and that sort of stuff. You still have to have a way to do that. And it's, you know, I could try to find out the companies that we use or that have that sort of thing. I know the boxes, they're all Campbell Scientific. Um, and obviously we use them for research purposes. They're like uh, $2,000 or $3,000 just for the box. But yeah, and you can even now there's systems that'll even measure uh, some water quality. Probes that'll do some of those things. It's just they tend to foul, not perfect yet, but they're getting there. Science and technology are growing quickly. How can you find the well survey for New Jersey? Well, so New Jersey is interesting because they're the first state to require testing at property sale. So for about 25 years now, every time a home is sold with a well, the buyer and the seller have to agree on who's going to pay for it, but they have to get a water sample done through a certified lab for all the constituents that the state of New Jersey requires you to test for. And so from that, they get about 13,000 samples a year. That doesn't mean they necessarily have the well log, but they have the location. And so you could probably find out, since you're the owner and you haven't been there that entire time, if it was before or before that law was in place, you could probably find out some information from them. But again, that's where I would start. I would look up the New Jersey Private Well Testing Act, and the folks there can lead you to where there might be logs, if there are, and where how accessible those are, or maybe it's at the county or local health department level. In some states, they're not held at the state; they're done at a more local health district level. Um, Ironically, the guy who runs that program is coming to our conference next week to give a talk about their program. So, because you know, as a researcher, if we had 13,000 samples a year in Illinois from different parts of the state with the water quality, we know where there's arsenic and PFAS and everything else. What an amazing data set they have. So you're kind of lucky. They know, and you can look on maps. They don't show individual wells; they show them on a 2-mile grid. But you can see if there's any natural contaminants like arsenic that might be in your area if you go to their website, and they've got a mapping tool. So um, hopefully that helps. About the spacers that could interfere with lowering the tape measure device in the well, what company was he talking about? I think it's Solence, like this. Gosh, I'm terrible. I haven't looked at the stupid name tag on that thing forever because I've used them for 15 or 20 years. Um, hold on. Yeah, there's no S. Solence. So it's this. Oh, there's an S missing. That's why it didn't look right. Solanced. And when I just Googled that, it came up with the options were water level recorder, a whole bunch of different things. So that's the company that we get those from. We used to just use steel tapes. We had to have them custom made. And luckily, we don't have to use those anymore. In some cases, we do, but few and far between. All right. Well, thank you for staying, those that did. And if you have any other questions, you know where to email us. You should have already, if you're going to get a certificate, you should have already asked for that. And so I say that because we used to ask everyone to email us at the end of the webinar if you want a certificate, but now we don't need you to do that. Yeah, if you wait a week, you don't get a certificate, email us then. And actually, given that it's Wednesday and we're all leaving this weekend for a week, expect some of those certificates to be delayed until closer to the end of around say the 28th or 29th. And that's just an artifact that our entire team is going to be gone. There's 9 of us going out there to run a conference. So if anyone's going to be there, look forward to meeting you. All right. Take care, everybody.